everyone, Lasley here, welcoming you to a post-commentary Let's Play of Kirby Nightmare in Dreamland, or as the commercial said it, Kirby Nightmare in Dreamland Kirby! Also, may or may not be related to Kirby Right Back at Ya. Actually, it's not, but they were advertising it around the same time. So this is the remake of Kirby's Adventure on the NES, which is actually the very first Kirby game that I ever played. The game came out when I was 2 years old. I probably played it when it was like a year or 2 year old, so it just happened to work out. I wound up skipping Kirby's Dream Land, so I skipped out on the first entry that didn't even have copy abilities. And so, what's Kirby? Kirby's a pink puffball, flies around, hovers, and eats up enemies and bad guys, really anything that he can suck up, because he seems to be a walking vacuum cleaner, if you ask me. Especially in one of the newer Kirby games, where the gimmick is literally to become even more of a vacuum cleaner than he already was. Also, I keep saying he. I'm not sure if Kirby is a he or not, but you know, it's just one of those things you don't really have to stress about, you know. But anyways, Nightmare in Dreamland is a remake, and the original, you know, I'm doing a Let's Play commentary. It's just more of a commentary to do like this, because I want to do something like this if I decide to do another one of a newer Kirby game. It's actually very good. But anyways, we'll go through a bit of a history lesson for these two parts. It's going to be a really short playthrough. What we're doing right now is a mini-game. It's kind of like a hot potato, but with bombs. This is a mini-game that's exclusive to the remake. It wasn't in the original. The original had a crane game. And another one, it was a crane game. It was the quick draw. And the quick draw is in here as well. I'm sure I show it off at some point, because this is actually a 100% playthrough, which will show off all of the hidden switch locations. Which is something I don't think you worry about until World 3, but I think I get to World 3 in this part. I don't know, we'll just have to wait and see. But anyways, yeah, Kirby, this is the first game, or rather, Kirby's Adventure was the first Kirby game to enable you to acquire copy abilities from sucking up specific enemies and bosses, such as the boss we're going up against right now. Poppy Brothers Senior, I believe he's called. The reason I don't suck him up, though, is because normally, Poppy Brothers, when sucked up, will give you the bomb ability. However, something you may not be aware of is that Bomb did not debut in Kirby's Adventure. It actually debuted in Kirby Superstar. I actually did not know that for a while, and I had to look that up, because I think I was wondering that while I was recording this playthrough, actually. I was wondering, wait, why am I avoiding getting Bomb when Bomb has a pretty good ability? Oh, it's because in Kirby's Adventure, or even this remake, Kirby Nightmare in Dreamland, there is no bomb, there's only Crash. And I don't mean Crash Bandicoot, I mean Crash as in Kirby basically does a gigantic explosion that crashes the screen of enemies. It clears them out, basically. And yeah, that's what you get from the Poppy Brothers Senior boss. I don't know if you actually get it from the regular Poppy Brothers enemies, but it's neither here nor there. Something else that's a little interesting about Kirby's Adventure / Nightmare in Dreamland is that some copy abilities, nowadays in newer Kirby games, copy abilities like fire and ice are one ability. However, there was a time when there were separate abilities that were similar. So what I'm using now is burning. However, there is actually a separate copy ability called fire. Fire is a more projectile-based ability, while burning is a more physical kind of ability. Burning is like a physical, you're doing a physical tackle with it. It also gives you iframes, so that's always good. And fire enables you to breathe fire. It's not a very far-ranged breath attack, but it's mid-range at least. It gives you more range than Spark, which I was using a lot of earlier in this part. Yeah, Spark can be pretty good. But another similar situation, oh by the way, there's also these copy ability museums that will give you access to specific copy abilities. And this is Sword, one of the most iconic copy abilities in the Kirby series, and one of my favorites. It's also one of those copy abilities that actually tends to get better in the newer games. Well, most of them get better, to be honest. It's just that some copy abilities have a rougher start than others. So this is actually the other situation I was alluding to. So, we just acquired the Freeze ability from defeating Mr. Frosty, which is like, not the first mini-boss, but it was the first mini-boss that I got to in this game that really left an impression on me because it takes a lot more than a few seconds to kill him off. Sometimes it takes half a minute. It's like 30 seconds, but you know. Yeah, Mr. Frosty definitely left an impression on me. When I played Kirby's Adventure, the Poppy Brothers singer, not so much. But anyway, Freeze is an ice-themed ability. However, there is also an ability called Ice that, you guessed it, one of these is more physically oriented and the other is more projectile/breath oriented. The Ice gives you the ability to breathe ice. And Freeze is just a close contact freeze ability. And the Kirby Superstar, I believe, was the one to merge them together more or less into one, which makes a lot of sense. However, my theory, I think it also could be the actual case, but my theory is that since this was originally an NES game, you know, for the original Nintendo system from 1985, okay? Or if you want to go older than that, like the Family Computer Disk System or whatever, the Famicom in Japan, you know? But there were probably system limitations, which meant that copy abilities could only be one note. You could only do one thing. And that is why there's a separate burning and fire, freeze, and ice abilities. Even though you would think that actually it would be less data if they combined them, because then Kirby would only have like one form. But did you know that in Kirby's Adventure, Kirby didn't actually get different costumes like he's getting in the remake here, or in most Kirby games? I can't recall off the top of my head. I think it might have been Superstar. That was the first Kirby game to give him costumes for the copy abilities, but yeah, in the NES game, it was pretty much Kirby wouldn't change anything because the NES was an 8-bit console, so the graphics were limited. So Kirby would get abilities and he would be able to do them, but they would usually be one note and he didn't really change appearance very much. Yes, this includes the fact that Sword Kirby didn't have the Link hat. Yeah, it's pretty interesting to think back on it. I'll admit, I remember playing Kirby's Adventure a good bit, but as the years rolled by, and I got into like Kirby 64, and then I got into Nightmare in Dreamland, which came out not too long after that. Yeah, somehow I skipped Superstar, and like every Super Nintendo. No, look, I somehow overlooked the platforming Kirby games on the Super Nintendo, but I actually played a lot of Kirby's Avalanche, which isn't even really a Kirby game. It's actually a reskin of a Puyo Puyo game made by Sega. I don't know how Nintendo swung that back in the day. Like, in retrospect, I'm severely confused about how that came about, considering Nintendo and Sega were competitors at the time. But I think Puyo Puyo was developed by Compile or something like that, and maybe Sega didn't own the rights at the time or something? I don't know. Either way, I played that, and I also played Kirby's Dream Course, which I was not crazy about. But the fact remains that I technically played more Kirby's Dream Course, I only played like half an hour of it maybe, than Dreamland 3 or Superstar back in the day. I didn't get into Superstar basically until the remake came out on DS. I know it's kind of weird, but yeah, you're not going to see me being as blindly loving Superstar as some people, but I do acknowledge the brilliance of that game, and especially its remake. But, anyways, going back to Kirby Nightmare in Dreamland, now we're using the wheel ability, which is interesting because in Kirby Superstar, you had helpers. And you could actually ride on the wheel helper, which was pretty neat. But in this game, the original or the remake, it's kind of a one-note ability. It just lets you move along really quickly. Speaking of quickly, we're going through this game pretty quickly, aren't we? We're already midway through the second world. For some reason, this game takes the approach of having every world be slightly longer than the previous. So, you're probably going to be seeing some of that. And I'm hoping we do start to see some switches, but we don't see those until the... Okay, this, UFO. This is a really cool copy ability. So, it's generally pretty rare, as in you're not going to see it pop up very much. In fact, I think after Kirby's Adventure / Nightmare in Dreamland, the next time it shows up, I think, is Kirby and the Amazing Mirror on GBA, which actually came out after Nightmare in Dreamland, the second GBA Kirby game. And I think after that, the next appearance was Kirby Planet Robobot on 3DS, which was like 12 years after. Crazy, I know. But, yeah, UFO is generally a pretty rare ability, to say the least. But it's a really good one. So, Kirby can fly around infinitely. He's not beholden to hovering. He can move around at a fairly good pace. And he basically gets the beam ability baked into the tool set. Oh, and here we go. There's a Meta Knight. I'm sure a lot of you Kirby fans are familiar with Meta Knight. Kirby's Adventure was his first appearance. It was not Kirby's Dream Land. Kirby's Dream Land is mostly the first appearance of Kirby and King Dedede, but not Meta Knight. Meta Knight was Kirby's Adventure, which actually came out the year after Kirby's Dream Land, so, you know, you didn't have to wait very long, for what it's worth. But, yeah, I mean, the Kirby release schedule back in the day, looking back on it, was really strange. Kirby started out on handhelds, and was mostly a handheld series for a long time. But occasionally, Kirby would get entries on home consoles. It's just, it was really sporadic, right? So Kirby got Kirby's Adventure on the NES, 2 years after the Super Nintendo came out, by the way. And then Kirby got 4 Super Nintendo games, but again, one of them is technically a reskin of Puyo Puyo, and there was the Kirby Superstar, which is a platforming game. Basically, the follow-up to Kirby's Adventure. Dream Course is an original spin-off as far as I know. And then there was Dreamland 3, which is actually the sequel to Dreamland 2, which is obviously, well, Dreamland 2 is kind of weird, in that it's kind of a sequel to Dreamland, but it's also kind of the start of its own, like, side story, called the Dark Matter Trilogy, matter of fact, that starts with Dreamland 2 and ends with Kirby 64. So it actually spans 4 games. And Dreamland 3 released a year after the N64 released. So, yeah, Kirby on home consoles tend to be really weird, and Superstar released the same year as the N64. Hopefully it was in the spring, whereas the N64 released like the summer or the fall or something like that. You know, just in time for the holiday season. But, yeah, Kirby releases on home consoles were really sporadic and didn't really have a clear pattern for the most part. The only noticeable one is that usually a Kirby game was released really late in the home console's lifespan. Which got better with each home console, actually. You know, Adventure was late to the party by 2 years. I think technically 3 years in Japan, because the Super Nintendo released there in 1990, but yeah, better late than never, though, right? But Dreamland 3 was the last Super Nintendo Kirby game. That released the year after, so only 1 year late. We go to the Nintendo 64, and thankfully, they did manage to release a Kirby game for it before the next console came out. Not by a lot. Kirby 64 released in the year 2000. And I think it was, as I recall, I believe it was May of that year, so the spring. So it managed to be released well over a year before the GameCube came out, so that was good. But then, the Kirby series of home consoles really took the oddest pivot that I know plenty of Kirby fans like this game that I'm about to talk about. Kirby Air Ride. The game is alright for a spin-off. It becomes, like, more than alright if you play it in multiplayer with other people. But as a single-player experience, as a spin-off, Kirby Air Ride is just not a replacement for a proper Kirby platformer game, which the GameCube did not get. It couldn't get it because there was a Kirby game in development for it that wasn't a spin-off, but apparently it got stuck in development hell and wound up being, like, factored into Kirby's Return to Dreamland, which released on the Wii the year before the Wii U came out. And Kirby Air Ride, surprisingly, is, like, one of the earliest Kirby releases on, well, I mean, like, relative to the home console, releasing in the year 2003. So, 3 years before the Wii came out. I gotta admit, that's pretty good. You know, only a couple years after the system came out. Could have done so much worse. By the way, this boss is, Paint Roller? Yes. Also kind of talked over Wispy Woods earlier, but yeah, Wispy Woods is notorious for being, like, the most common first boss you go up against in the Kirby series. A pattern that I never really noticed at first because of the weird play order that I went with for the Kirby games. I still should have noticed it, though. Because he's the first boss in Kirby 64, first boss in Kirby's Adventure. I guess maybe what threw me off is Kirby's Avalanche. He's not the first opponent in that game. He's one of the first, but he's not the first. And then, Dream Course, I don't know. Yeah, and I didn't play any of the Game Boy Kirby games back in the day. My time on the Game Boy, the original Game Boy, was mostly spent on Pokemon. Before Pokemon came out, the only games I recall playing were Super Mario Land 2. Not even the original Super Mario Land, because the original Super Mario Land released 2 years before I was born. But Mario Land 2 was only a couple years old when I was old enough to get into video games. So, Super Mario Land 2 was it. You know, somehow it wasn't Super Mario Land 3 Wario Land, because, I don't know, I probably found Wario pretty scary at that age. I wouldn't blame my past self on that one. Anyways, welcome to Butter Building, where this is going to be the first world where we have to worry about hidden switches. And you're going to need to have... Sometimes you're going to need to have specific copy abilities to find the switch. And that can be kind of annoying, especially in Kirby 64, matter of fact. There are a lot of situations where there's a collectible and you need a specific copy ability combination. And that can be frustrating at times. But I still love that game dearly. It's one of my favorite Kirby games. Although recently I think it might have been topped by the most recent Kirby release as of the recording of this video in December of 2022. Yeah, I would say it's a contender. But what game that is, I would rather say, because I think that's going to be the next Kirby game I do commentary for. I don't want to spoil exactly what it is, but you probably know what it is from my implications. Consider this a prequel to that, because I feel it would be weird for me to jump into the newest Kirby game without at least doing some older Kirby game beforehand. Alright. Butter Building, and this is a great time to pivot towards talking about the soundtrack of the Kirby series. I have not heard a Kirby soundtrack where I thought it wasn't at least good. And a lot of them, people would probably classify as bangers. You know, such iconic music tracks like King Dedede's theme, or the Butter Building theme, honestly, or Green Greens, you know? Hey, speaking of which, kids, don't forget to eat your green greens, right? Yeah, it's pretty funny to do that. Oh, and this boss right here, this mini-boss here, Bugsy, also one of my favorites in the series. Just design-wise, and the fights are always fun. But the copy ability you get, Backdrop, oh yeah, that's another thing too. This game has Backdrop and it has Suplex, but I'm pretty sure in future games, those abilities were either combined into each other, or were combined into the fighter ability. Which, by the way, I'm pretty sure was not an ability until Kirby Superstar. I'm pretty sure that's another ability that wasn't introduced in this game. And you need to try and be on top of, keeping that in check, because, yeah. Looking back, it was pretty interesting, the order in which I played Kirby games. You know, I went from Kirby's Adventure, basically, and then a few spin-offs, and then Kirby 64 was basically the second Kirby game I ever fell in love with. So, you know, that was great. And then I managed to keep up with Kirby pretty well after Kirby 64. You know, I got all the games on GBA when they came out, then the DS, and so on and so forth. And believe it or not, 7 years after Kirby Air Ride, Kirby's Epic Yarn came out. And that was technically, even though that was also not really a Kirby game, it was actually a reskin of, like, another game that Goodfield, the developers, were going to do, based on the character Prince Fluff, but somebody thought it would be a good idea. Hey, why don't we just make it a Kirby game? Which is funny because Kirby game, there have been some experimental Kirby games in the past, such as Kirby Canvas Curse, for example, or even Kirby's Dream Course could be considered that as well. But it's pretty interesting that instead of making Kirby into an experiment, they used the Kirby IP as, like, an insurance to ensure that the game would do well. And it did do well. Helped that it released during a year where the Wii was still somewhat relevant, you know? 2010. I'd argue that was a really good year for the Wii, but I don't want to go too off topic here. But the point is, Kirby's Return to Dreamland released the year after, and then it was just, you know, basically the best Kirby game in years. Like, I enjoyed Kirby's Epic Yarn well enough for what it was, but Kirby's Return to Dreamland, oh my god, man. That game was just great. And that's saying a lot, because 2011 was a year full of great platformer releases. Sonic Generations, Rayman Origins, Super Mario 3D Land, and Kirby's Return to Dreamland. I mean, it was a pretty solid year. Kind of all over the place in terms of the console releases, like which went where, but still, I have fond memories of that year. And then after that, you know, we had 3DS games, which were also really great. Basically followed up on Return to Dreamland's core formula, which in and of itself was kind of an advancement of the Superstar formula. But Superstar felt kind of like a compilation of different stories and modes. Whereas, you know, I'm just going to get off that and talk about Quick Draw, my favorite minigame in Kirby's Adventure or Kirby Nightmare Dreamland. It's very difficult to get Meta Knight on here. I'll confess, this was recorded off an emulator. I use save states. I wanted to show off each of the minigames at least once in their complete, or as complete as possible, capacity. So I technically cheated, but I cheated so that people can see the entire minigame play out. If I tried to do that without save states, I think the most I've ever been able to do was reach Meta Knight, but not defeat Meta Knight. I'm pretty sure it's only a few friends. Oh, and here we have another iconic Kirby mini-boss. I think I like this guy more than Bugsy, actually. It's Bonkers. And one reason I've always liked Bonkers is that his design reminds me a lot of Popeye. And believe it or not, even though Popeye's a really old cartoon series, like we're talking the black and white era old, they did a lot of reruns of old shows like that in the 90s, especially on Cartoon Network, because starting out, Cartoon Network didn't really have any original programs. So instead, they opted to just rerun stuff from the Warner Brothers back catalog, and Popeye, which I'm not sure if it was Warner Brothers or not, but they did do reruns of that on there too, and Tom and Jerry and such. But anyway, I watched a lot of that, and Bonkers' arms in particular look just like Popeye's arms, so that connection was really nice in retrospect. And funnily enough, I'm sure Bonkers doesn't eat a spinach, but, you know, still very strong, and a pretty strong opponent to deal with if you don't have a really good copy ability. Or God forbid you try to do a Kirby boss without a copy ability. It's possible, but you have to depend on the boss throwing out stars as projectiles, right? And you have to suck them up and spit them back at him, which is just kind of annoying. It's also really slow, you know? Speaking of which, this is a good time to pivot to another discussion point, and that would be the difficulty of the Kirby series, or perhaps the lack thereof. And I will say that Kirby's Adventure, and Nightmare in Dreamland, but maybe to a slightly lesser extent, is arguably one of the hardest Kirby games. Not to beat. It's one of the hardest Kirby games to do no damage. And here's why. You see this room, right? And we're in a bunch of enemies, hard not to get hit, right? Yeah, you would think so. This game spams enemies a lot. And to be fair, since Kirby relies on enemies to get copy abilities, spamming enemies has to make sense to a certain extent, of course. But it's to such a degree that it can definitely get obnoxious. They give Kirby 6 units of health, which is nice. And the Kirby games are designed, they're meant to be for beginner players, right? Before we get on that, though, I do want to comment about this boss fight. I was skipping over the other two, but I don't want to skip over this one. Mr. Shine and Mr. Bright. I love their designs to death. So much so that, actually, my brother did too. My brother and I were both into Kirby back in the day. And this is a really good time to bring up a fun fact. I don't know if I'm going to have enough time for the full story on this in this part. Hopefully in the next one, because we're about to do Great Garden. I think we're going to do the entirety of that. So, wow, the first 4 worlds in this part, huh? So I wonder why this is the shorter part. Anyways, so my brother and I really liked Kirby back in the day. Funnily enough, even though I didn't play that much Kirby, he didn't really play Kirby at all, but he enjoyed watching me play Kirby. And I think to some extent, he kind of liked it because he knew I liked it, and he just wanted to, like, you know, do some cool older brother stuff. You know, he tried. For the most part, he succeeded. But the cool thing was that when Kirby Nightmare in Dreamland came out and the anime Right Back At You also was airing, this is happening at the same time, we actually came up with like a Kirby comic series. And I feel so bad that I don't think I have any of those comics anymore laying around, or if I do, they're probably so far back in stories that they would be really difficult to dredge up, and it wouldn't even be all of them, but I still remember he actually created an original character called Eclipse, that I kid you not, was the combination of Mr. Shine and Mr. Bright, so the sun and the moon combined, and he called it Eclipse. I wish I could show the design on screen, but that would be a little tricky to do with the editing software that I use, or rather that we use here at Blue Studios, I meant to say, you know. But I do have my own editing software, though. Sometimes I do edit the videos, actually. I'm gonna be honest, most of the time I edit the videos because I have a very particular standard. But anyways, yeah, the Kirby comic series we did was really cool. A bit limited by our artistic abilities, but since my brother was a couple years older than me, his sense of drawing was still probably not great in retrospect, but definitely a lot better than mine, which were basically just glorified doodles. However, I was able to improve my drawing by looking at what he did, and also doodling a lot in school. Actually, it was ever since we got into the Kirby comics that I actually started doing a lot more drawing in my spare time at school. Sometimes to the chagrin of my teachers. But in retrospect, I don't think a teacher should ever shut down a student for drawing, especially if they already did their work and are just drawing to pass the time. But in retrospect, I also must confess that sometimes I did draw instead of doing my work. And I think maybe that was the only time they got on my case. But, you know, hindsight, memory, bias, and all that stuff. I'm just like, eh. Although sadly, I never really wound up being an artist or anything like that. It's just something cool that I like to do on the side sometimes. I did kind of transition to doing sprite work. It's just that back then, I had to start off just doing crappy recolors. Eventually, I managed to get good enough to make sprites from scratch. They're not great or anything, but I finally got that ability, like, 10 plus years after I first got into it all, but hey, better late than never. That's kind of the recurring theme here, isn't it? Oh yeah, there's also like battle arenas in Kirby's Adventure and Nightmare in Dreamland, but those are basically just arenas where you fight bosses you already fight in the main story, and it's another way of getting copy abilities if you don't have any in between the levels. But anyways, going back to the Kirby comics, man, those were so cool. I thought about getting back into that, but at this point, I just feel like if I have any ideas or inspiration for that, I would try to translate it into another medium that could potentially be shown off online. And, you know, I could buy a scanner and, like, draw some stuff and scan them and put them on a DeviantArt account or something like that. But one, DeviantArt is freaking dead at this point. And two, like I said, I think I'd rather put that into something else, you know? Another way of expressing one's creativity, as it were. But, anyway, let's try to finish off this video by trying to focus on Kirby for the most part. I find it interesting that sometimes throughout the playthrough, some enemies actually change color. So you notice that the flying pink enemies, they're called Bronto Birds. Now all of a sudden they're green. And it's kind of a fun fact because, you know, Kirby does turn green in some situations, mostly in Smash Brothers, but Kirby and the Amazing Mirror, the plot of that game is that Kirby is split into 4 other Kirbys, colored Kirbys, because of the mirror, I think. Split into a pink Kirby, a red Kirby, a yellow Kirby, and a green Kirby. Kind of mirroring like the Player 1, Player 2 colors a bit, but there wasn't a blue Kirby. They didn't want to replace the iconic pink Kirby, which is understandable. Oh wow, this copy museum is a bit meaty, but actually one of them is Ball and the other is Sleep. Sleep is kind of a, what's the word I'm thinking of? Not gimmick, but like a trap. It's kind of a trap copy ability in the fact that if you get the ability from the enemy that gives it to you, you go to sleep and you're unable to move for a few seconds. It's harmless, usually. But if there are enemies around, you might get hit. And if you get hit, you do wake up, so... I mean, there's that. But, the ball ability is pretty interesting, because there's, like, these ball physics with Kirby, right? And it's pretty interesting how it all plays out. Although, generally, I find that the more gimmicky abilities like that, I'm usually not a big fan of. Or, they actually improve upon them in later Kirby games. I have that feeling about the tornado ability. And I'm not sure if I tried to show off every single copy ability in this playthrough. I should have. If I didn't, I should have. But probably I just stick to using the most useful ones, which, hey, can't blame myself too much. By the way, that boss, Fan, is exclusive to the remake. In the original Kirby's Adventure, it was a different boss that looked more like a turtle. And I do remember that enemy. I just don't remember what its name was. But I do remember that enemy quite vividly. And for some reason, I completely forgot about it when I first played Nightmare in Dreamland. I'm like, ooh, an elephant with 2 legs. It's so adorable. And I didn't at all I didn't stand to think, wait, what happened to that turtle boss? I like turtles, but I also like elephants. I like a lot of animals, so... There are actually very few animals that I outright dislike. And it just so happens that most of them are in the insect category. I don't think I'm alone in that regard. Oh yeah, look, the sword copy ability guys. They change color too at the Blade Knights. One of them is a Sword Knight and the other's Blade Knight. I want to say actually the one I just sucked up, or that one right there, is Sword Knight. And the other one that I got in a museum was Blade Knight. They're actually loyal to Meta Knight, believe it or not, but they don't show up during these enemy encounters because that would be giving you a copy ability, which would be an advantage. And I think Meta Knight just wants to try and make it a fair fight. This seems like his style, and it's going to be obvious when we actually get to the inevitable Meta Knight boss fight in the next part. I'm positive, because we're only going to see one more boss in this part. This is an iconic boss from the original Dreamland, so... just have to stay tuned for that one. Pretty sure Paint Roller and I know for a fact Mr. Bright, Mr. Shine are exclusive or original to Kirby's Adventure and the remake. And Paint Roller, I think, is the same case. Not 100% sure about Paint Roller. Not 100% sure, but I want to say the original Dreamland bosses were Wispy Woods, Kracko, Kabula, and Dedede. I'm pretty sure. Oh, no, there was one more. Lolo and La La La. There we go. Wait, that's 5 bosses. Oh, right, because there were 4 worlds, and then Dedede was the final boss. Yeah. Also, kind of funny how in that game, you had to do a boss rush right before Dedede. And at that point, it's just like, man, just get it over with. Why are you trying to extend a 15 to 20 minute game with a boss rush? Oh yeah, Kirby's Dream Land was like a half-hour game at most. And I'm pretty sure Game Boy games cost $30 back in the day. So, wow. You'll have to replay that game a lot to get your money's worth. But to be fair, I'm sure it's doable. Because Kirby's Dream Land is a good game. It's just that a lot of Kirby games that came after it were just doing its formula, but better. I'm trying to remember what the name of this clock boss was, because I seem to remember it being a pretty good name. Maybe it was like Mr. Tick-Tock or something like that. I don't know. I know of the names of a lot of the bosses, particularly if they stuck around for future entries. Fun fact about Mr. Frosty is that I think he was absent from the series, not counting remakes. I think he was absent from the series until Kirby Triple Deluxe, believe it or not. Or maybe Return to Dreamland, I don't know. It's the kind of thing I would have to look up. Probably not going to look it up between parts, to be honest, but yeah, I probably should look into that somewhat. But anyways, this dark room is one of the only instances where you have to use the light ability. I say have to, that's only if you don't know where the invisible door is, which I do because I played this game a bunch, and or just used save states and reloaded, and you know, when I found it, I would just reload the state and go to it immediately. Speedrun strats, even though it's not a speedrun, but I like to do efficient playthroughs that don't waste the viewer's time. It's just my style. See, I've always been raised on the mantra, do unto others and treat others how you would like to be treated. I don't want my time to be wasted. So I don't want other people's time to be wasted, and that is part of the mythology that goes behind the videos that you watch on this channel. Whatever that channel may be. I don't know. Maybe next year we'll decide to go with a different brand. Maybe we'll, instead of Loose Goose, we'll be like, Spruce. Oh yeah. Part of the reason we went with Loose Goose is because it rhymed. You can't really, I don't know, Frog Dog? No, that's just 2 different animals. Dang, I'm actually not very good at naming channels, aren't I? Anyways, that was Kracko. See you guys next time when we finish off the game. Yeah, take care. Enjoy the Kirby dance.